Before all creation, he saw the Theotokos. He saw the existence of the Mother of God, Cosma. He saw the Theotokos before all creation. And he was so pleased that Saint Nicodemos of Holy Mountain made this statement, which got him 22 years of persecution from some illiterate monks at the Holy Mountain a couple hundred years ago. He said that if all the angels would fall and become demons, if none of the people would go to heaven, God would have created the world just for the Theotokos, so his son would come and incarnate. Because the reason and the purpose of the creation was for God to become one of us. So he could become hands-on with his creation, because God is uncreated and he cannot touch or come in contact with the creation, because the creation will incinerate, will explode, will burn. And that's why the Panagia had to be prepared and watched from the angels, and also all the generations would be handpicked for her. So by the time she would be born, she would have so much holiness. Joachim and Anna were very righteous, as the scriptures tells us. Righteous means they had all the virtues. She was a child of prayer, and that's why God did not permit them to have her when they were very young. They had the Panagia very late in life, when piety and wisdom and impassion increases. So she was a child of prayer and holiness. She was so holy from the beginning that although she had the ancestral sin, she had to have the nature of the ancestral sin. Even though she had that sin, because of that holiness and sanctity and the grace, she did not give in to the inclinations of the ancestral sin like we do. Okay. So she is most holy from the beginning. So at the age of 3, when she went into the Holy of Holies, and this always used to be one of my questions. Now, the Jews were not very easy people to deal with. The Pharisees, and they're very legalistic, and no one was allowed in a temple. Let's say this was the temple. The people were outside. Only the priests would be allowed in the temple. Okay, in this space right here, only the Levites. Only the people would be outside in a courtyard. They would bring their animals, sacrifice them. The priests would take them, and they would go out, and they would throw the blood on the different vessels, in the altar and whatnot. But only once a year was the high priest permitted to go into the Holy of Holies. Once a year. And sometimes the priest was not very worthy. He also died in there. Okay. So they had to go pull him out. And that's why, when Zacharias was in there for a while and he wasn't coming out, they were concerned. So what happened to him? See alive? Okay, so you can see the kind of child she was and why the Jews were able to just, they gave in, because she had so much grace. She was so radiant, fragrant, even at the age of 3, she was stunning. Even someone would look at her. There was just a miracle child right in front of them. And when Zacharias looked, you can see this child is of the Holy Spirit, and this is the will of God. She has to go into the Holy of Holies. And, he kind of took her in there, and then Archangel Gabriel was feeding her for the next 12 years. She was studying the prophets in the Holy of Holies, but she was constantly praying for about half of the day. And Saint Gregory Palamas says that because of the excessive prayer, she discovered the prayer of the heart. She's the first hesychast, where instead of using a lot of words for prayer, she just focused her nous, the essence of the soul. He focused, her mind, connected it to the heart, and through that, she was beginning to get to heaven and have, of course, the uncreated light from that time on. And she became the first Hesychast and the example of all future Hesychasts. She is the first one who devoted her life to God, and she promised virginity to God according to St. Gregory of Nyssa. You could do this in the Old Testament. In the book of Numbers, somebody could become Nazir to God. A Nazirite was someone who would devote himself to God. And people would do it for a year, 2 years, 10 years. Samson was Nazir. Okay, he couldn't cut his hair, and he couldn't eat grapes or drink wine. These were people who were Nazirites. They were basically devoted to God. And from the beginning, she promised virginity to God, and that's why when the Archangel Gabriel said, you will have a son, she says, wait a second. Up to now, no problem, but wait a second. How can this be since I know no man? Okay. Now, if there was any chance for Joseph to be her future husband, then that statement would be relevant. Okay, that statement would not be necessary. You're going to have a son. Okay, well, yeah, okay, fine. When I get married to Joseph a year from now to you, I will have a son. Wonderful. Okay. But that was not on her mind at all, and that's why when that statement came across, she was ready to give up being the mother of God if it would mean that she would have to lose her virginity. So that's why she just rebelled at that point, says, how can this be? I know no man. And only when the angel said, the Spirit of God will overshadow you, and you'll give birth to the Son of God. This child will be the Son of David, the Son of God, and he will save his people. Only at that point, she said, let it be done according to your will. Okay, in complete obedience and humility. So the Panagia is the miracle of miracles of humankind, the greatest person of humanity, the complete person. And when St. Nicodemos said that, that's what he meant. Of course, the monks didn't understand it, and they persecuted him for 22 years for many other reasons as well. And for a good reason. St. Gregory Palamas says that after the resurrection, it was not Mary Magdalene who saw the Lord first, even though that is mentioned in the Gospels a number of times. If we read the Gospels on the surface very quickly, if you're just reading, just like we read a book, we read, okay, just because we have to read a gospel a chapter of the gospel every day, we'll see that, early in the morning, Christ appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Okay? That's one of the gospels. The other gospel says Mary Magdalene and the mother of Joseph. Another gospel says Mary Magdalene and the mother of Iacovos, James. Another gospel says, the myrrh-bearing women, Mary, Joanna, and the other Mary. Who are all these Marys? The mother of James, the mother of Joseph, the other Mary. Okay, it's the Panagia. It's the Virgin Mary. And by the grace of the Holy Spirit, the evangelist silenced her witness because her witness of the resurrection would not be very believable to the unbelievers. No Jew would believe that his mother saw him resurrect. Yeah, right. Okay. So that's why they silence the presence of the Panagia during the resurrection. But St. Gregory says that it was right and meet for the Panagia to see her Lord first. So if we read the Gospels very carefully, we'll read Matthew, who gives some explanation, and then Luke a little bit more, and then, of course, John, gives a much more extensive explanation. Matthew says there was an earthquake, and an angel came down, and it was like light, like lightning. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were at the tomb, okay, after they went to anoint the body with myrrh and spices, which was the custom of the Jews. For about 7 days, they would go to the tomb and anoint the body, because a lot of the tombs back then, they were hewn in rocks, like modern day mausoleums, where you could actually just put the person inside, and they could visit him, just like Lazarus, same way. So St. Gregory Palamas says that it wasn't Mary Magdalene. She was there, but she didn't see a thing. And the reason for that was when the Panagia is walking to the tomb with Mary Magdalene, we had the same scene of transfiguration. The angel comes down with full of glory with the uncreated light. Mary Magdalene is not ready. Her eyes are very weak. Just like the disciples, when the light of God came down, they dove. They couldn't handle it, okay, because the Holy Spirit had not come yet. It wasn't Pentecost yet. Later on, they will be able to, after the resurrection, they will be able to see the resurrected Lord when they were strengthened. But at this point, these three disciples who were very advanced, presumably the most advanced of all the other disciples, that's why he took them up there. But even so, when you come in contact with the supernatural, just that fear overtakes you, and they took a dive. And Peter was in a daze. And Luke says, Peter didn't know what he was saying. Lord, it's good for us to stay here. He was just like mumbling. He didn't know. He was delirious. And the same thing happens to Mary Magdalene. When the archangel Gabriel came, and he did this just for the Panagia. When he saw the Panagia coming to the tomb, he came down to welcome her. And he pulled off the rock off the tomb. When the guards, when they saw that light, they were what? The gospel says?
As dead.
As dead. They were out. They carried themselves. They crawled away and they took off. Okay? That's how much fear they had in front of the presence of God because of the impurity. And someone needs to become extremely pure to come and see the uncreated light of God. Moses had to purify himself for 40 days. He stopped all the people for 40 days before he went up to Mount Sinai. They had to stop for 3 days. Before he came down, he told all the people to fast for 3 days and not to have any marital relations at all for 3 days, purify themselves, so they would take into their hands the law of God. And that's why our church fathers teach that that's the minimal. I mean, if that's what people did in the Old Testament before Holy Communion, we also abstain for a minimum of 3 days. Of course, the spiritual father will be able to tell us, what's necessary for each one of us. So, the all-pure Theotokos was not only afraid, she sat there and she spoke with Gabriel face to face, and she took on all the joy of the good news. And at this point, Mary Magdalene is, she's in a daze. She doesn't hear a thing. She knows something is happening. She sees inside the tomb. She saw that. She doesn't see a body, but she missed the whole thing that went on. Missed the whole thing. Remember, on the road to Damascus, what happened to St. Paul when the uncreated light came down and struck him? He was blinded. St. Paul was also blinded, just like the guards, because at the time, he was like the guards. He was an unbeliever. He was an enemy of the church. So he was totally blinded by the uncreated light. So they dragged him into Damascus, and then he was baptized, and his eyes were open, and then he became the great Saint Paul. In the same way, Saint Mary Magdalene was not blinded, but she was awestruck. She didn't see this, didn't hear exactly the conversation, and that's why when she runs back to tell Peter, she has no idea about the resurrection. Not at all. Although St. Matthew says Christ met them, and some of them worship him at his feet. Again, the reason why Matthew is doing this, so he would not exclude only his mother because the account would not be believable. So he also includes the other myrrh-bearing women because they also went there, so include them in the gospel as well, okay, because of their faith and their love. But it was only Mary, the Theotokos, the most holy Theotokos, that saw the Lord. After Mary Magdalene took off to go to Peter, okay, he met his mother, and she fell and worshipped him at that point.